This is the MeCCSA Radio Studies reading group. Today we're joined by Rute Correia, who we're talking about her paper, which is called Community Radio Stations Sustainability Model, an Open Source Solution, which appeared in the radio journal International Studies in Broadcast and Audio Media in 2019. And over to you, Rute.
Okay, let's see if I can share my screen. Share screen. Yes, I allow. I think it's this one. So can you see it?
Yeah.
Great. So my presentation here is going to be very short, and I decided to do kind of a short personal background into how I ended up researching this. And then I'll go very quickly over the things that I find the more important things in the paper. So yeah, the title of the paper at the minute is also the title of my PhD research. I'm doing a PhD in communication at ISCTE, which is a Lisbon-based university, and I'm being guided by Professor Jorge Vieira, who comes from the sociology field, and by Professor Manuel Aparicio, who comes from the information management field. Now, I started doing radio in 2007 at Radio Zero. I was studying media studies at humanities and social sciences faculty, but my faculty did not have a radio station, and somehow I ended up at the engineering campus. These pictures that you see are from about that time. I don't know if they're from 2007 or 8, but they're from about that time. As you can see, it was a very small studio. I can tell you it was 4 meters by 3 meters. So it was 12 square meters, probably smaller than a lot of our bedrooms, I'd say. And the first time I stepped into a radio station's studio, it's also the first time that I become aware of open source software and free software. This on the right side, you see a zero quando nasce para todos. It's a play on a saying that we have: when the sun rises, it is for everybody. So Radio Zero, when it rises, it is for everybody. They were very much anchored in an open source ethos of sharing resources, and also of using the radio station as an access to a more democratic life, to a more engaged life as a citizen. So it was pretty much, I didn't know then, but I know now that it's very much deep-rooted in the idea of free radio that we see, for instance, in most continental Western Europe. So countries like Spain, France, Germany, Italy. Typically, when we talk about community radio in those countries, it's free radio, and Radio Zero was pretty much a free radio station. Fast forward to 2015, I joined University of Sunderland, where I became part of Spark. Spark was also a community radio station, but it was almost like an opposite experience, because it was, I'd say that one studio of Spark would be bigger than the whole of Radio Zero, and Spark obviously has, I don't know, 5 or 6 studios at the minute. It's well embedded within the media faculty of University of Sunderland, and I couldn't help but notice that even though they were so different, they also shared some particular features, obviously, like being a community radio station, and that comes with a set of not so much ideologies, but commitments towards their community, but also in terms of struggles. Now, Spark didn't really struggle financially because it's, like I said, embedded within the university as part of their learning structure for broadcast media students and also MA radio students and whoever wants to join along the way. Whereas Radio Zero was part of the students' union. So they were very limited in terms of funding, something that didn't really happen with Spark. But they both struggled with keeping the community engaged and making sure that they always had enough people to run the operation. And in my mind, maybe because my first experience with radio was Radio Zero, this idea of open source and free software and not free content, but open content, it always made sense to me that it came connected with community radio as free radio. And even though I didn't really see that in Spark, I was, that period coincided with me going a bit more into open source communities. And so I was really interested in connecting the dots. Now, connecting the dots has been the biggest challenge of my PhD work at the minute, because when I started in 2017, I had all these ideas about the things that I wanted to look into regarding software usage and content produced, etc. But I realized later that I was missing some key pieces. The connection between community radio and open source was pretty much uncharted when I started. There were a few hints here and there in literature, but most of it was really, really unconquered territory. Also, both fields of studies are fairly recent. So even though it's community radio has been written about here and there, in comparison to other media like television or cinema, for instance, it's still vastly unexplored. There's just so much to do there. And the same with open source. Free software only appears in the 80s, and open source as a concept appears in the late 90s. So it's all very fresh. So there wasn't a lot that combined the two. Yeah, so Kovichko and Khan really helped frame this idea of exploring open source as a sustainability model for community radio stations. And the fact that there is a three-party approach help us understand that when we talk about how open source can be part of a community radio station's operation, we're not talking about just the technology itself, but we're talking about a whole range of things, namely the content, which here is materiality, and the experience, which here is the community. So the paper addresses pretty much that. So the lack of academic studies on the sustainability of community radio stations, and also the lack of connection between open source and community radio. When we mention sustainability in the paper, we're very keen on having our understanding of sustainability is, of course, the continuity of the broadcast operation over time, but also the fulfillment of a community radio station's role as an organization of inclusiveness and participation. I think this slide is pretty much the big, it kind of summarizes what I think is the achievement of the paper, which is the identification of the common features between community radio and open source. So in the yellow circles, we have the things that we observe in both universes and that are necessary for both of them. So we need a radio station to maintain a continuous operation, the same way we need software to be continuously developed. You know, otherwise there will be security issues and becomes obsolete, etc. And of course, both have a symbiotic nature with their community, which tends to be mostly volunteer. In both cases, community radio and open source, there are cases of people who work for the station or for the open source software company, but the projects are always largely fueled by a community of volunteers. It's made for the community and by the community, and neither the community exists without the station or the software, and vice versa. So the software and the station don't exist without the community. And then also then we have in the gray circles, the two features that can appear in community radio movements or open source movements, but are not necessary. Arguably, they're not necessary. So one is the fact that they can be considered social movements. And in some contexts, we know that community radio has been a social movement. For instance, in the 70s, in Italy, it was very clearly, it operated as a tool of contentious politics. And it was a well-defined social movement. You can argue, for instance, that in the UK, before community radio station regulations were in place, that it was also acting as its own social movement, for instance, and that happens in open source as well. There are specific, I'm going to call it trenches of open source movements that can be defined as social movements, like some particularly areas of hacktivism, so hacking and activism put together, which are very much intertwined with open source. And then the fact that either one can have a transnational nature. For instance, community radio stations can be connected to a specific diaspora. They can have projects that require or that link different parts of the world and different countries. And the same with open source, of course. Open source code development happens mostly online, and that fuels transnationality. And then this is the other thing that I think kind of can be seen as some sort of groundbreaking theory research, which is not only the connection in terms of technology and content, even though it was unexplored, there were already some guiding lines regarding how Creative Commons licenses, for instance, can be embedded into the production of radio content. But here it's really where our work goes a bit further, which is the connection of the community governance and the community aspects of each universe that are kind of the same. So O'Mahony in 2007, she outlined 5 features of community managed governance models for open source software communities, and they can be pretty much just directly transposed into community radio stations and in fact most community media, but since we're talking about radio stations here, let's keep it like that. And on this table 1, which is a reference to Gasek's work also in defining features that you can find in open source software, like the community, the motivation, the developer's profile, the process of accepting submissions, the development improvement cycles, and then the modularity that can also pretty much be transposed into the community radio station realm. And so these are the very basics of it, and I think that these are the key findings of the paper. And yeah, now I'm ready for your questions.
Thanks, Hoot. Well, I know Joe's got some questions that people have sent in, but first, maybe I can ask the first one. How much of this is what you're describing what's already happening, and how much of this is a model that you're developing that you can then go to community radio stations with and help them apply it?
My idea initially was to synthesize what was already happening. And then I realized I didn't have enough theory background to go that route, and hence the paper. On the paper is mostly a model. There are a few specific examples of things that are already happening, but it is mostly a theory model. I'm currently working on specifically on content. It's the last part that I've been dealing with, and in that case, it's more empirical. So I have some more developed case studies of stations that are using it and trying to figure out how and why they prefer copyleft content in comparison, for instance, to copyrighted content. But yeah, for the paper, it's pretty much a model and not so much something that's already happening.
Thank you. And one of the questions that came out from the discussion we had a few weeks ago, could you delve deeper into the table that you showed just now and is in the paper?
Yeah.
And to clarify the practices which overlap, and are there any case studies which you can then summarize from that table?
Yeah. So yeah, the table comes from, so yeah, on the first column, we have the open source software features that GASEC suggest that all the open source projects have. Okay, there are a few other features that may or may not happen in these software projects, but these 6, they're always present. And actually, I can tell you, because I've got here some notes, I can tell you which ones are the ones that are optional. So it's a bit, not optional, but they may or may not exist. And it's a bit like the yellow circles and the gray circles. So some we can always find them, and those are in the first column. And the other ones I can, because they're actually quite a few, I'll give you some examples of features that we may or may not find in open source projects, which is to have a meritocracy type of culture, to have a balance between centralization and decentralization, to have a choice regarding field of work that you want to do, also the starting point of the project, the visibility of the software architecture. So there are a few other things that sometimes are there, sometimes are not. But these ones, they always exist in every open source software. And in fact, there is something that is, I think it's actually a key expression that they use, I think, which kind of makes, for me, kind of make the difference, which is, yes, so they provide an assessment framework to determine whether a project is open source or not beyond what they say. And this is quite interesting because, for instance, there is Miguel Midães, he's a Portuguese researcher, and he's looking into community radio stations in Portugal. There is no legal framework for community radio stations in Portugal. So legally, they don't exist. but we know that there are cases of radio stations that identify themselves as community radio stations. But he came across a different example, which was a radio station that did not want to be defined as community radio station because they didn't think that that term applied to them. But then when we look at the features, they are a de facto community radio station. And it's the kind of the same here. So regardless of whether a software project says it's open source or not, we will find these features if it is. So of course it has a community. The community is very well defined, active and engaged. And it's the same with community radio station. There's no community radio station without the community. We have to know, for instance, in the UK, it's very clear. You have your community is stated, for instance, in your key commitments. Who you're talking to, 15 to 24-year-olds in Sunderland. That is your community, and that group is also the group that controls most of the decision-making and production efforts within the radio station. There are quite a few examples here. I don't remember which one I got it, but yeah, I guess the example with Spark is very clear. We can argue, for instance, in the case of Spark in Sunderland, that some of the decisions are not necessarily being taken by the students regarding financing and like actual administration of the station. But they pretty much choose the course of the content, and that's one of the key features. So in a way, they choose how to develop the software, or in this case, they develop the radio station. Yeah, so then the motivation, before we talked about how the community was mainly made by volunteers. And you can only have volunteers if they are motivated. There are a few papers that are very focused on the motivation behind being part of an open source software, but also the motivation behind being part of a community radio station. If you're not being paid and you're spending 40 hours a week there, why do you do it? It seems to, for me, as this my empirical, and now I'm going to go back to my personal background, the motivation was, or the lack of thereof, was one of the key issues that was common between Radio Zero and Spark, was that whenever students graduated, what was the motivation to keep them still connected? And Spark didn't have that problem so much because there's always a new wave of students. But if your new waves of students is not motivated enough to take part in managing the station and controlling what is happening on air, then you're going to have a problem, and there will be no station in 2 or 3 years. Then the developer's profile. Here is, I think it's a bit of a tricky one, but King's work in 2015, which let me check the actual title of the, yes. It's actually very interesting paper about community radio audiences, which is not very easy to, it's not very easy to find and to work because, the metrics are always for the industry. But yeah, so Gretchen King, it's a paper on Participation's Journal of Audience and Reception Studies, and it's Hearing Community Radio Listeners, a Storytelling Approach from Community Media Audience Research. So one of the things that they argue is that the producer is also an active listener of the station. And it's, in a way, yeah, this sentence, all open source developers are users, but not all users are developers. So the producer of the community radio station will be an active listener, but it doesn't mean that all the listeners will be active producers. So even though it's symbiotic and they kind of populate each other's spaces, it doesn't necessarily work both ways. Then the process of accepting submissions, we can argue that a community radio station to be a genuine community endeavor has to be open to receiving new shows, for instance. Now, the processes can differ greatly. It doesn't mean that they have to always be open. For instance, Radio Zero had seasonal kind of, not tenders, but seasonal open calls for new shows to kind of handle the load of evaluating and mentoring new members. But it can also mean, it also means that the way they do it is not necessarily the most open or the most democratic, but they have to be open to new submissions. And in the same, and it's basically the same with open source software. It is only open source if you're allowed to improve. So if you're allowed to add new submissions. A very practical example is when GitHub, which is a platform to share software code, basically we can make a pull request, and a pull request is basically saying, I improved something, here's my code, you can add it to your software. Then kind of linked to accepting the submissions is the improvement cycles, which in software, they can be broken into breakthrough and continuous improvements. So a breakthrough is any major new version of the software, and a continuous improvement is after releasing a major version, there will still be tweaks and adjustments and smaller improvements to the software. And it kind of is like that with radio stations as well. Occasionally there will be a breakthrough. It can be the premiere of a new schedule, or it can be a major event that is happening at the station that really forces the station to produce a greater effort and produce bigger change within it can be the, well, I'm going to focus on the content ecosystem, so the broadcast of the station. But then after that happens, you know, either things go back to normal, or you can continuously tweak here and there. So to give a very practical example on top of the new schedule, say if a station has weekly changes on their playlist, that can be considered a breakthrough. But then if during the week they realize, oh, this song actually, it doesn't sound quite as well as we thought it would, and let's move it from this category to the other one, that would be a continuous improvement. And then, yeah, so the modularity has to do with how different departments don't necessarily have to work together most of the time. And we know that radio stations organize themselves slightly differently. So that's something that might be helpful to understand modularity. Unlike commercial stations, which has a very rigid and specific structure, in community stations, sometimes you have volunteer managers, sometimes you don't, sometimes you have specific technical departments, sometimes you don't. And for instance, in Spark, it's very obvious that there is a clear detachment of the technical part of the station and the administration part of the station, and then the content part of the station. And then the content part, there's also there will be someone typically dealing with voluntaries and making sure that people are well received and whatnot. But the technical part is assured by an employee of the university. And so the students don't really have to worry about it. I mean, they have to know that if something goes wrong, they have to tell the person in charge, or if they need something specific, but it's not something that they have to worry about on a daily basis. Whereas, for instance, in Radio Zero, there was a specific technical department, which was run by a group of students, and there was a marketing department, and there was a content department. There was no actual volunteer department, maybe because they were all volunteers, but there were some processes in places to make sure people were mentored when they started doing new shows, etc. But yeah, like these different teams, of course, they have to communicate with each other, and they're all vital for the station to survive, but they work separately.
That's a very thorough answer. Thank you. One of the things that occurred to me while you were talking was you seem to be talking a lot about within a station, within one station. Is there a case for, I've been at a few stations and they kind of end up generating this knowledge independently, whereas there might be the case, and there's forums and things, but there might be the case for kind of sharing globally this kind of knowledge amongst community radio stations in a GitHub kind of style way. Would you say that's a good way of approaching it?
Oh yeah, definitely. For me, it was my previous, my first knowledge of community radio stations was pretty much anchored in Zero and their sister stations. Zero is part of the radio network, which is a network of radio stations dedicated to radio art. And at the time, and this was the founding years of Radio Network, there were a few other stations within Europe. I can think of Orange in Vienna and Reboot in Berlin. And I think at that time there were about 12 stations. And they all shared this ethos of sharing resources, of sharing experiences, and even sharing content, because the radio network had a shared, I think was a monthly show, where each month is produced by a different station, and then all the stations broadcast that hour of programming. And for me, it was very, very almost shocking to find out how Spark was doing things. But I do, well, based on literature and on personal experience, I'd say that a lot of the struggles, even though the stations themselves are very different, and there might be a few things that are not really a concern for some stations, they always struggle with keeping their community engaged. And more than managing the day-to-day activities, the problem tends to be the long run and not necessarily what's needed today. So yeah, I think sharing resources can definitely be an important thing.
And on the subject of open source software, have you personally, or will you be doing research into the practical implementation of open source software in community radio?
I would like to, yes, that is on the plan. I don't know when it's going to come out. I don't know when it's going to happen. Yeah, the last month, I'm going to say the last year, because yeah, the last few months have been a bit crazy. But yeah, the latest steps into my research have been about copyleft, but mostly focused on content, which was also quite challenging for different reasons, but mostly because there's not a lot about it. So everything is from scratch. And yeah, on that part, I'm not really focused on software yet, but I would very much like to look into implementations of software and development of software. And I do have some interesting interviews that I've done over these last couple of years, but nothing that allows me to say that there's a lot there.
Okay.
But hopefully, yes, I would like to look into that, yes.
You talked a little bit about your background. Do you think that the fact that you started in a radio station which was located within a science department has informed your IT focus on radio software, and that's the reason where you are now, I guess? Would you say that's the case?
Oh yeah, definitely. I had no, I mean, I liked computers and technology, but I had no, I had never thought about software until that specific moment. And it was really a game changer. Well, I'm doing a PhD in open source, but yes, it made a huge difference. And because, also because I think it really broke the view that radio is just the content, and going a bit more generalistic here of how all our actions are political and how the choice of software can be a political thing. It doesn't mean that it always is, at least not voluntarily, but the fact that when you choose a specific software, and we are dealing, Radio Z is a very, very interesting case because most of the people who were running the station were pre-engineers. And so we had a skill set, a technical skill set that was very advanced. And so they had the motivation, they had the means, and they had the knowledge. And so even though they didn't have a lot of money, and like money was the real restraint there because sometimes they wanted to do very outlandish things, but they organized radio festivals, for instance, and they did concerts on the top of a tower, because Instituto Superior Técnico has two big towers. And I don't know, I can send pictures. Or just go to their Flickr. Their Flickr has a very interesting archive of things that they've done throughout the years. And there would be someone on a meeting saying, why don't we put an antenna on the top of the tower and we do a concert on the tower? And like, these are like proper towers, like 30 floors high, they're huge. And someone else at the back of the room would be screaming, yes, let's do it. We can get some cables and connect here and there. And so it really made me rethink radio, not only as a hub for content, but a hub for creation, and creation outside the broadcast space. Of course, the broadcast is the key element of radio, but it was also the first time that I learned about radio art and things that were beyond mainstream broadcasting. And this is a bit of a parallel line here that I'm going to make. And one of my main issues with podcasting research is that I've never heard a podcast that I thought this would never go out on a community radio station. And we can think that technology can change things and whatnot, but content-wise, it's still radio for me. And yeah, I think that experience in Zero really changed the way I think about things and made me think of radio as a more wholesome thing, not just the content, but everything else around it.
Could you talk a little bit more about why exactly open source, having the code available to be adapted, all those sorts of things, why is that such a good fit for community radio?
Oh, okay. So yeah, so open source software is software that has the source code available. And even though there are a few philosophical and ideological things that are slightly different from free software, open source stems directly from free software. And software to be free, and free And yes, the ambiguity of the word free in English, free as in free speech and not free beers, although a lot of free software is free as in both. But it doesn't have to be free as beers, it's just free as free speech, and it has to grant the user a set of 4 freedoms: the freedom to run the software as I please, the freedom to study the software, to look into the code and to see what it actually does, the freedom to improve if I want to, if I need to, and also the freedom to share my improvements with whomever. And these are the 4 freedoms of software. And in the case of community radio stations, for instance, and I think it's also crucial to think that we now live in a time where there's an immense amount of software available for almost anything online that you can get for free or for a small fee, and everything is compatible with everything, but that was not always the case. And 10 years ago, or 12, 13, in 2007, for instance, when I started doing radio, Linux was still very, very scary. It still is for some people, but it's kind of less. And there was the internet wasn't nearly as developed as it is nowadays. There was no Facebook, but also there weren't things like SoundCloud or even Free Music Archive, which is a very well-known repository for open music. Yeah, so in that sense, software, the fact that you can improve the software and tailor it to your needs can be crucial to community radio stations. They often operate under a tight budget, and if someone has the skill set required to improve a software, that can definitely help them improve their operation.
Are you a coder yourself? Do you do coding?
I can code a bit, but I'm a beginner. I wasn't a coder until very recently, and now I can code a bit.
At the risk of getting a bit technical, what are the kind of major open source software packages that community radio stations are using in common?
From my initial interviews, I'd say Audacity, which is a digital audio workstation, or maybe just audio editor. Workstation might be a bit of a stretch for Audacity, but it's the sound editor. LibreOffice, which is a free software version of an Office suite like Microsoft Office. A few years ago, OpenOffice would be the equivalent. There's also this thing called Butt, which is broadcast using this tool, which is a tool for broadcasting. And it's some very simple software bit that makes wonders, apparently. And in some cases, I've heard radio stations that use Mix, which is a DJ type of software, so for making DJ sets. And these are the main software that I've seen used. I know of other softwares like Airtime, which got discontinued. It was a playout system that was open source and was being used, for instance, by Resonance FM, at least for a while, but it got discontinued, and now it's a software as a service where you pay a subscription to access the software. And it was a playout software and also a schedule manager type of software. And Rivendell, which is also playout software. And my understanding is that it's fairly popular in the US for low-powered radio stations, but I don't have any specific data about that usage.
Are there any sort of obvious gaps in the kind of ecosystem of community radio where there is a big need for some bit of software which could be developed open source?
I think the loss of airtime from open source to software as a service is relevant in that sense. I think you can probably find almost everything you need to do radio within the free software open source ecosystem, but it might not be as easy to set up or as user-friendly as some of the commercial tools. And yeah, airtime was pretty advanced, and it was open source. So even if you were able to set it up for yourself, it was a really user-friendly, really good user-friendly solution. There are a few forks, which is like when software gets, for instance, it's like a clone of. I'm not using the technical term. I'm trying not to go very technical, but there are a few forks of airtime. So there have been people which got the original source code and now are developing other things. But the fact that airtime was being developed by a software developing company, and it was basically specifically a media software developing company, I think it was quite a big loss because it was easy to use and it didn't scare newcomers.
So to change the subject slightly, a question about the submission or publishing process. Is it usual to add your supervisors as co-authors to articles?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
I'm
Yes.
not sure. Is that a Portuguese thing or is that just? I guess you don't.
I don't know. My understanding of this universe is that yes, supervisors tend to be credited as co-authors. In this case, they had a very active role in improving the paper and helping me navigate through some of the things. So they are credited as co-authors. I'd say that the bulk of the research is mine, but the final product is definitely ours.
Is this your first paper that's been published?
Yes. Yes.
And how did you find, as somebody who's not been published yet, how did you find the process?
I had a few mishaps because there were a few emails that kind of got lost, and then like the initial submission was scary because you know you don't really know what you're doing that well, and I found everybody was super nice along the whole process, but yeah, there were a few emails that got lost, and so apparently the paper got accepted, and then the editors said, okay, we accept this, you should change this and that. You know, you have a review process where reviewers tell you that maybe you can improve this part or that part and whatnot. And I didn't see that email. It went to something like that, and I found out on the day before the deadline, and that was pretty intense. And then I was emailing my supervisors and apologize. It's like we did not see the email. Like there was no email. I don't know what you're talking about, because we got an email saying, so where is this reviewed version? It's like, what reviewed version? But yeah, other than that, it was I think it was, you know, I felt quite lucky because we hear all these horror stories about publishing and peer review, and I felt like the peer review was actually very useful, and it provided genuine feedback and helpful things that could be improved. And I mean, today I was looking at the paper, I hadn't looked at it for a while, and then I looked at a few things and thought, this could have been improved. But yeah, the process was scary, but I guess it doesn't have to be. it was scary just because I hadn't done it.
And you mentioned that your PhD is going to build on this. It has the same title at the moment. So, what are your future plans? Are there more papers coming out? Is it all work towards the PhD now?
Yeah, so I'm doing my PhD by publication, which is an option here. So we have to publish 3 papers on specifically indexed journals, and so I'm planning to publish 2 more papers. When and where, I don't know yet. But my initial plan was to have a paper focused on content, one on technology, and one on community. Because I published this one, which kind of blends the 3 things, at this point, I am not super sure how I'm gonna unfold this, or how this is gonna unfold. But yeah, I've been working mostly around content at the minute. So Creative Commons licensed content, both so both things that are produced by the radio station that are then licensed under Creative Commons, but also the usage of Creative Commons resources and then incorporated into the radio station. And for that, I'm trying to build 3 different case studies. And I can tell you which ones they are. It's Radio Zero in Portugal, Radio Almaina from Granada in Spain, and Cause Commune, which is a Paris-based radio station. So I tried to keep it multinational whenever possible, because I feel like very often we entrenched ourselves in very specific realities, and we kind of it's very hard to detach something that is specific to that station or to that reality. And in this case, I wanted to go transnational. So I'm building these 3 case studies around copyleft content in community radio stations, which kind of leaves technology for last. And even the community part can be way more explored, but I don't know how that is gonna go. But yes, for now it's content.
Sounds great. Just quickly, because I know we're running out of time, but
Sorry.
you might have a unique insight into like the different community radio models in different countries. Would you say that we share more in common than the differences, or how different are the models? Oh,
The modules in terms of what? Sorry.
sorry, we lost you there for a minute, or at least I did.
Sorry. What do you mean by the modules?
Not the modules, the models. So like the way that they're set up in each country. Like you said, Portugal has.
Yes.
The UK has a very regulated system, as the UK
Yes.
tends to do. What do they share? Lots of things more in common than they do differences, I guess.
Well, for that specific thing, I very much into both the Portuguese and the British module, and I think they are very, very different. There are a few things that, I mean, it's still radio, but yeah, I mean, radio is a very, very heavily regulated realm in Portugal. It's very, very strict, and I think in a way it's it's a lot more, I'm going to say, bureaucratical than the UK. The approach seems to be more restricted in a way. But then, for instance, the Ofcom's broadcasting code is a lot more strict there than it is here. I was very shocked to find out that things about explicit content and how, there's no watershed in the UK, but also how it's almost impossible to play. I mean, at Spark, we had a hip hop show that went out at 9 in the evening, which was fairly late for UK standards, and we would even, it was a hip hop dedicated show with a very contextual parts. We would never dare to play the explicit versions of the song, for instance. And for me, that was a shock because here we have explicit songs during daytime, for instance. I'm not saying that there should be explicit songs during daytime, though. But, you know, it's almost like opposite ends of the same picture. But regarding things like giving out licenses and broadcast licenses and what you need to ensure as an operator, here I think it's a bit stricter. And at the minute, there are no open licenses. And if you want a license, you have to buy it from someone who already has one. And if you broadcast without a license, it can be a heavy crime. It's a crime, and you can go to prison for that. And
do you think that your model that you're developing for sustainability is one that will transfer across all these different regulatory conventions in different countries?
I hope so. One of my supervisors, Professor Manuela, she said something very interesting, because I was very stuck on the regulations issue and how it's different here from there, from Spain, from France, and it's impossible for me to know all the technicalities of each country's regulation regarding community radio. And she said that science comes always before law, because laws can change. And so in that sense, I would like this to be as universal as possible beyond the technicalities of specific regulations. I can't promise that, of course, and I'm well aware that, well, I'm looking mostly into European radio stations, which also exist in a specific social and cultural space. But I'm hoping that at least they can provide valuable insights for stations somewhere else, because the bulk of their operation is very similar, and how they build their own ecosystem is also very similar.
Well, thanks very much. I think we're coming up to our hour, so unless we have any more questions, I'll say thanks very much, Rute, for sharing your knowledge and talking to us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I hope it was useful.
Thank you.
Thank you.